Section 21. The Resurrection. Although Jesus' conviction that he was going to resurrect in 3 days can be explained naturally, the rapid and non-violent spread of belief in Christ after his death, despite harsh persecution, suggests that something unusual must have happened in Jerusalem in the 1st century. Given the information we have, it seems the most plausible explanation is that at least one person genuinely believed Christ had resurrected after his death, as there are no other apparent catalysts for the explosive rise of a new religion centered around a recently crucified teacher. Whether or not it actually happened, we must try to critically examine. To evaluate this claim, we will immediately set aside all 4 gospel accounts and all other miracles in them as potentially legendary or written to embellish a mundane Christ to appear more prophetic and messianic. Given that most historians believe that the earliest gospel was written after 70 AD, the miracles in question were likely recorded well within the lifetimes of significant locals who could contest the key events, given that Christ is believed to have been crucified around 30 to 33 AD. Yet there are no surviving historical testimonies that debunk them. Thus, this is a significant concession, considering the Gospels contain numerous highly public and geographically specific miraculous claims. The most notable of these miraculous claims is the empty tomb narrative, which is most commonly used in the defense of the resurrection, but won't be used here. Now that we have set aside the Gospels, many non-Christian naturalistic theorists acknowledge that something convinced the disciples of Christ's resurrection. Swoon theory is one naturalistic theory that suggests Jesus used drugs from the physician Luke to fake his death on the cross, and was resuscitated by Joseph of Arimathea in the tomb before appearing to the disciples. While this could have happened, I personally find this idea extremely improbable because this plan was contingent on Jesus not dying on the cross, a parameter totally out of their control, and a possibility the Journal of the American Medical Association states is irreconcilable with contemporary medical science. The most viable naturalistic explanation I have heard is that one disciple had a grief hallucination of Christ after his death, which they interpreted as proof of his resurrection, and the others accepted it. This view has the advantage that it doesn't require Jesus to live after the cross, doesn't assume a complex yet undiscovered conspiracy, would explain the disciples' willingness to hold on to their claims unto death, and only needs one disciple to have been convinced that the resurrection occurred. The only thing we have to assume is that the disciples were actually severely disillusioned and emotionally traumatized after the crucifixion, leading them to cling to any hope of their teacher's return. Because we are assuming this, it does mean we have to operate under the assumptions that Christ existed. He was a teacher they were fond of for whatever reason, and he got crucified for what he said or did, and died. We are still not directly using the gospel account for this theory, only trying to explain how the disciples might have naturally come to have experienced what is necessary for them to produce a particular grief hallucination about the resurrection. This provides us a naturalistic basis for the event, as grief hallucinations are actually fairly common, with somewhere between 30% and 60% of people reporting some form of grief-related hallucination involving visual, auditory, olfactory, or even tactile experiences. The probability of occurrence affected heavily by cultural, social, and other individual factors. Taking the individual factors parameter into account, if we had to guess which disciple was most likely to experience a grief hallucination, we could anticipate the Apostle Peter, who was outspoken and fiery in his loyalty to Christ, yet reportedly abandoned him, to feel the deepest longing for Christ's return. If Peter did experience a grief hallucination, it would need to be convincing enough for him to genuinely believe Christ did resurrect, and provide him with enough content to convince the disciples and others of what he had seen. At minimum, we could imagine this would need to involve some visual and audible experience, ideally lasting over 30 seconds. A combinatory visual-audible sensory experience is typical of roughly 10% to 15% of grief hallucinations, but if the experience was longer than a few seconds, it becomes far rarer. Even though unlikely, this sequence of events so far is naturalistically plausible. However, if we assume that the disciples were convinced with Peter's account of the resurrected Christ, for the belief in the resurrection to spread, they would then need to share what Peter saw with others while still at risk of persecution, torture, and death by the same people who killed Jesus. Here is where the naturalistic explanation gets more difficult. For the apostles to turn the beliefs of their neighbors to Christ, with their only evidence being Peter's hallucination, they must have had sufficient fervor to non-violently change people's mind through sheer confident testimony. This would be an impressive feat, considering any person they successfully convinced would soon know they were at risk of persecution, torture, and death. Yet some people clearly got convinced and held on to their faith despite persecution, so within this theory, we must assume the apostles' fervor was incredible. If their fervor was incredible, since their fervor was based on Peter's hallucination, that hallucination also must have been incredible. The more incredible the hallucination, the more unlikely it was to occur. The spread of belief in Christ's resurrection may have also been superstitiously assisted by some natural phenomenon that might have occurred around his death. There is some geological evidence that a minor earthquake occurred near Ein Gedi, sometime between 26 and 36 AD, which could be in line with the shaking of the ground described in the Gospel of Matthew after Jesus died. However, considering the epicenter would have been approximately 30 miles away from Jerusalem, and since the geological evidence suggests the quake was relatively minor, perhaps with a magnitude of 3 or 4 on the Richter scale, it probably wouldn't have been strong enough to have destroyed stone buildings like the author of Matthew describes unless they were already structurally compromised. If this earthquake did coincide shortly after Christ's death, it could have psychologically primed many for Peter's message of the resurrection 3 days later. Even if no unusual natural phenomenon coincided with the death of Christ, it is still not naturalistically impossible for rapid spread of belief in Christ's resurrection purely on Peter's hallucination to have occurred, considering its unique mimetic advantage. The novel promise of a bodily resurrection and a glorious afterlife would be more appealing than some of the shadowy afterlives of pagan faiths at the time. Furthermore, the emphasis on non-violently resisting persecution might have actually accelerated its spread. The model martyrdom and ultimate vindication story of Christ would inspire all new believers to not abandon their faith despite extreme suffering, and the highly public nature of executions at the time would make watching followers of Christ letting themselves be martyred difficult to forget. None of this detracts from the incredible example of sacrificial love and devotion that Christ demonstrated in his life, death, and possible resurrection. The ethical teachings of Christ have profoundly influenced history and remain deeply rooted in many cultures and ideologies across the globe. Nevertheless, even a hotly debated topic like what happened to Christ after his death must be critically examined, as it has extreme implications for how we should live our lives if it is true, one such examination being through a naturalistic lens.